In 1968, the United States was undergoing a period of civil tumult. In Islam, we call it fitna. The United States was facing urban rebellions throughout the nation every year. Hundreds of cities were going up in smoke. Black people were demonstrating for human rights and civil rights in the streets. The image of the United States abroad was the image of a hypocritical nation that talked about freedom and democracy and equality, but yet the world was treated to the images of dogs attacking peaceful demonstrators, police beating women and children in the streets. The image of the United States was at its all-time low. But at this particular point, the United States was still empire. It was still developing the consolidation of what we have today, or what I call the national security state. The national security state wasn't completed in 1969. Richard Milhouse Nixon. Lyndon Baines Johnson, after the Tet Offensive, said he would not run for president again. And he stepped down, leaving the door open to the Republican Party and Richard M. Nixon. Now, Richard M. Nixon, of course, we all know, had a history of red baiting and anti-communism. But Richard M. Nixon was no fool. He was a consummate politician, and he knew that in 1969, in that period, 68, 69, and 70, that he had to gain control of social culture in the United States. Political control of culture, political control of society, legal control of its citizens. Now we have to remember that in 1968, SWAT teams didn't exist. Did you know that? You always thought there were SWAT teams, right? SWAT teams didn't exist in 1968. In 1968, for instance, to give you an example, and this is very important to understand, you had major urban areas such as New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, New Orleans, that had some of the most corrupt police departments in the country. The New York City Police Department was one of the most corrupt police departments in America, as the Knapp Commission and the Serpico story would come out and prove. It was the Black Panther Party in New York City and in Chicago and in San Francisco that started organizing in the African community for community control of the police. Community control of the police. Not decentralization of the police, but community control. And community control meant that the people in the community would control the policies and the standards of the local police department. That they would impose a residency clause, that the police should come from the community that they worked in. Because most of the African communities were policed by white policemen who didn't live in the city, who didn't live in the community. They were an occupying army in the black community. And their sole purpose in the black community was not to defend African people from criminal activity, but to impose the status quo's will on people of African ancestry, to brutalize them, to murder them in the name of the law. You have to remember that to this very day, the United States does not admit to having political prisoners. To this very day, 20 or so years after COINTELPRO, America has no political prisoners. But I'm going to come to that for the benefit of our law students. But for the benefit of those who are a little more eclectic in their studies, I want to point out to you that this period of time, 68, 69, 70, marked a crucial period in America's transition from a bourgeois democracy to democratic fascism that we have today. So when Richard Nixon came into power, he saw all of this turmoil and tumult in America, and he says, well, we got to get control. Lacking a national police force, what was he to do? The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was conducting a covert program called the Counterintelligence Program that initially started its first practices were initially carried out against Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the head of the United Negro Improvement Association. Now, without going into the history of the UNIA and Garvey, suffice it to say that the techniques of the counterintelligence program that were to be developed in the 50s against the Communist Party, and it was used against black nationalists before World War I and after World War I and in between the wars, these techniques were first used and utilized on the plantations in the United States. Simple techniques, hanging people from trees, death of 1,000 cuts, waterboarding. Y'all just heard of that. Crackers used to do that to Africans on the plantation on a regular basis. It's nothing new. These techniques all existed. These techniques of torture, divide and conquer, internalization of hatred to the point of self-hatred. All of these techniques, more than 2 Negroes in one place at a time constituted the conspiracy. The only time Africans were allowed to get together were in church on Sundays or at, Catfish Row on Sundays. And who they had to listen to? They had to listen to the minister. And you know how that turned out. We wound up with Jesse today. We still listening to ministers. But having said that, these techniques of the counterintelligence program, divide and conquer, misinformation, defamation of character, arrest and coercion, physical violence, intimidation, terrorism, were all techniques that were employed in the antebellum South. But they developed and changed as America developed and changed. And by the 1960s, 1950s, America was undergoing a process of urbanization and the development of a global technological infrastructure. These developments, urbanization of America, the war in Vietnam, the migratory patterns of American working people, the struggles of African people for human rights, the struggles of women for their rights, the anti-war sentiments in the country, all constituted a nation about to explode. But his problem was he didn't have a national police force to repress all of this protest and all of this movement. And you remember, those of you who've seen all the movies and stuff about the counterculture, you know about the hippie movement, right? You know about the counterculture. It was the summer of love. This was a period where counterculture was beginning to supplant the mainstream culture, especially amongst the youth. And a consequence of this, of course, was that young whites began to interact more with black people on a very fundamental level. This was an era in which blacks and the culture of, quote, the counterculture began to come together. So Nixon was very shrewd. He said, well, we can't have this. This is getting out of control. So he ran on the ticket of representing the silent majority. He launched the war on drugs. He established an alliance with the Mexican government and began to spray the marijuana crops with pakwai, which was a form of Agent Orange. He sprayed the marijuana crops with pakwai, the Agent Orange, and people started smoking that stuff when it came across the border and bugged out. But the war on drugs was Nixon's initiative. And what was the purpose of the war on drugs? To consolidate law enforcement, to politicize law enforcement, to give law enforcement the opportunity to acquire military skills for domestic repression under the guise of curtailing the importation of legal drugs. So he launched the war on drugs as soon as he came into office, and he established the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEA, L-E-A-A. And LEA was designed to provide federal funding to local police agencies. If you had 2 black people in town, you qualified for anti-riot government subsidies. Didn't make a difference whether the 2 black people in town were 2 professors or not. You were qualified for federal funding to prepare your police department to deal with racial unrest. This was the purpose of the Law Enforcement Assistance Association. And it was out of this particular program that the SWAT team training, the relationship between the military and domestic police became regularized and institutionalized. It was out of the law enforcement, out of the LEA mandate that FEMA was formed. You all know about FEMA. I mean, all we have to do is just reflect back on Katrina and we know about FEMA. But did we know that the Timothy McVeighs and the so-called right-wing All-Americans who support the Sarah Palins and the John McCains were all in state militias, began to become politicized in state militias that were given charters under the LEAA administration, under FEMA. State militias were supposed to be first responders in natural catastrophes. That was the, the facade that was put up. But who joined these state militias? Ex-Ku Klux Klansmen, Minutemen, right-wing John Birch Society types, ex-cops, military people. They all joined these militias. But remember, these militias were supposed to be for civil response to natural disaster. So under the pretext of providing government services for natural disasters, the Nixon administration put in motion the development of a police state in America. These were the kernels of the police state that we now see in America today. And you know what held up that development for 10 years? What do you think held up that development until 9/11? What do you think held up that development until 9/11? What do you think changed Nixon's plans? Forced them to modify his plans, delay much of them, and abandon some of their objectives. What do you think forced them to do that? In one word or in 3 words? Organizations like the Black Panther Party. So you see, the Black Panther Party was eminently successful in its 4 or 5 years of existence. Its success lay in the fact that it delayed, if not postponed, the consolidation of fascism in the United States for at least 10 years. It was necessary for the government then to devise a new strategy to consolidate police power in the United States and to take away the civil rights of people in this country. What developed from Richard M. Nixon's campaign to politicize the police departments, to create an atmosphere that would be conducive to the American people submitting to a police state, was very ingenious, and it took a period of time, but it worked. It worked. And what Richard M. Nixon did, despite the fact that, he was hounded out of office, what he did was he created the foundation for what the Patriot Act would consolidate. Because in the Nixon administrations came up with the Omnibus Crime and Safe Street Act, which was an equivalent, a domestic version, sort of equivalent of the Patriot Act. Every time that the United States empire is in crisis, and it has to institute laws that the people know are against their better interests, it creates a terrorist persona, a threat from the outside, and then it passes legislation to address that threat.